I would like to start by applauding Graham for a fantastic presentation and paper. It was really insightful, and also looking at the perspective from the very poor in sub-Saharan Africa. I would like to mention five points that I see as very important. The one is actually acknowledging the breadth of the problem and how different it can be in different geographies, and this way broadening the scope and finding specific solutions. The second thing is I would argue for a much more quantitative approach to housing. I'll explain that in a second. Thirdly, I would say that an enabling approach in most situations and geographies, there's no one-size-fits-all, needs to be more interventionist than many of free market advocates like myself would like and think. Fourth, that will likely include subsidies for the most vulnerable segments, including supply-side subsidies. And fifth, when it then comes to finance, it needs to be much broader than thinking about finance for consumers and specifically mortgages. So let me very briefly touch on each of those points. In terms of the scope, roughly 330 million households globally face affordability challenges regarding the housing situation. That obviously urban households, I shall say, and I'm focusing on urban households here because there is an element where the rural households often face more income and poverty issues than housing issues. And those, of course, include a lot of households in very poor countries in sub-Saharan Africa, in South Asia, and so on. But it also includes roughly 100 million households in Europe and in the US. And it also includes roughly 100 million households in, say, middle developed economies like Brazil and China. And very different solutions and situations apply there than in sub-Saharan Africa. So things like mortgage finance, which we rightly learned are not reaching the intended target groups in Africa, make a lot of sense in cities like New York. So it's kind of, in terms of the scope and understanding which solution fits where. In terms of a more quantitative approach, I think we all heard about a lot of examples of things that work and things that don't work. But I was also very impressed by the numbers that you showed, Graham, in terms of the income pyramids and really how few people can be addressed by the programs that are being put out. Many of us will probably have seen case examples, for instance, about the program in Ethiopia, presenting it as a huge success. And in many regards, probably it is a very huge success. But for those 1 or 2% of the population where it matters. And I think that's more broadly a gap that I see, even in the most developed places, like, for instance, New York, which is arguably the city with the longest history of affordable housing programs, experimenting pretty much with any policy that there might exist on the planet. Recently launched a very comprehensive strategy, very ambitious strategy. But even there, the simple math of new housing construction not even meeting half the rate of formation of even low-income households in the city don't stack up. You cannot solve an affordability issue if you don't produce housing for those who come to live in your city. So, and the simple math of how much supply versus demand is there, but also extending that into broader surveys to really understand what is the situation of households, where do they currently live, what would they spend their money on, how much money is there, how expensive is housing compared to that, why is it expensive or not expensive, and where. A lot of granularity is needed and is missing even in the most advanced places. When I then come from that to the enabling approach, or maybe less enabling approach and more interventionist approach, you can imagine that McKinsey usually has its roots more in the spirit of free markets than many other organizations. But the reality is urban land and housing markets are not free markets with very few exceptions. You might find very free urban housing markets, for instance, in Midwest and US or in Texas, arguably the most or the freest housing markets, and that can work. So our running of the numbers shows that these are some of the most affordable places on this planet compared to the income situation. And the only reason why there's currently a lot of stretched households is because they chose to buy 250 square meter houses rather than what they can afford. So the full free market approach, almost laissez-faire, can work, but it is not the reality in most places. And even in the US, places like New York or San Francisco look very different, where urban planning, density controls, urban boundaries, and so on, place serious constraints on housing development. And unless you want to move to a much more liberalized model on that front, you also need to be much more interventionist on how you then supply housing if you accept that your housing market is not a free market. And looking at that from some of the ingredients of toward housing, and then also what it may mean for subsidies. First, houses need to be in the right spots. You need land, you need urban land in good locations with good infrastructure access. The reality is that particularly in many developing economies, infrastructure is in short supply, and our estimate in Brazil delivered at roughly half the rate of 4% of GDP that would be needed annually. India, I think, is at roughly 4 to 5% of GDP, should be at 7% of GDP to meet the population's needs. So a lot of places where infrastructure is in short supply. And the reason for that is not finance, as it is suggested by much of the discussion. The reason for that is a lack of capacity and governmental agencies to provide those projects or to even develop those projects, and a lack of funding. And funding in the sense of unwillingness to put the tax money behind the infrastructure, unwillingness to face the reality of charging users a fair rate for the infrastructure, or the other way around. If you accept that this is a reality and this money will not flow, then the 1/3 element of funding infrastructure is property value capture. Actually, socializing the uplift from value that you get by putting social money to work to provide infrastructure. And that is one of the most important points, I would think, also when it comes to housing policy. Actually, putting the infrastructure in to develop the urban land that is needed to bring low-income households close to their places of work, but then actually also attracting the kind of commercial developers, the market level renters or owners, the retailers, the businesses, and so on, that can pay the kind of money that this infrastructure improvements allow, capturing the value from the land improvement related to that, and using that money to provide housing for those who need it for shelter. And that leads me to the point on subsidies. When we looked at the amount of money needed to provide housing globally for those 330 million households who currently lack it, then this requires a $16 trillion investment. If you wanted to provide a standard that would be considered decent by many, at least say Western standards, and we can discuss whether that's the right aspiration, but $16 trillion would be roughly the number. The low-income households affected can afford to pay around 8 trillion of that if they are provided with the right financing models, which is a big if, but if they were, they could afford roughly half of that money. This will in reality not stack up. Governments will probably not find the other $8 trillion. However, roughly 5 trillion out of those $16 trillion would be land. And I would argue that land is, or should be, or is in reality a different market, whether it is for shelter versus for investment. And I think that's also what you experienced in Barcelona. In many particularly developing market cities, land prices have converged to global averages driven by a global elite that is able to pay those prices, as well as by global investors, and this way fails to meet the needs of the local population for shelter. If you are not prepared to find ways to provide this land at marginal cost or essentially for free, by making public land available, potentially retaining ownership, as is the plan in Barcelona, or the reality in Barcelona, potentially by working with concepts like density bonuses and so on that essentially put more units onto the same land, but giving that additional density at marginal cost to low-income households, then this gap cannot be bridged. It is too large a gap. If you are prepared to find that land, which in some ways is a supply-side subsidy, taking that land cost off, optimizing construction cost, which in our estimate can yield another 2 trillion in savings, and finding ways to mobilize that purchasing power or financing power of 8 trillion of low-income households, then the 16 trillion go down to 1 trillion viability gap. If you set yourself an aspiration of 10 years to solve this problem that has been with us for probably a few centuries, that's 100 billion a year of governmental money. 100 billion, that is not a lot of money. It is very doable, but it's only very doable if we are prepared to make the right decisions and tackle this problem heads on and in a quantitative way. And that leads me to the last point on finance. Now, how can we mobilize those 8 trillion and are mortgages the right approach? So mortgages can be an important element in some contexts and geographies. I already mentioned the US, for instance. I think in Europe, possibly more could be done to provide mortgages to lower income households where they want to own. And I think there's a big if. Certainly the concept that you also find in most of Europe of giving tax subsidies for ownership is very counterproductive. It pushes up land prices even further in places which are usually supply rather than demand constrained, and helps only the rich who actually have high tax charges. But beyond mortgages to low-income households, it's very important to also think about the financing along the entire development chain, including and particularly including the developers. And the developers that may stay on to own the asset and actually rent it out. And for that, there's a lot of things that are also actually very important things that are outside the financial market. We already heard that developers are usually interested more in the luxury segment than in the affordable segment because of the higher margins and just the higher prices compared to transaction costs and all the good reasons that we all know. Having said that, our discussions with developers suggest that what one would actually expect, that they're most interested in return rates, IRR. They want an internal rate of return depending on risks, between 15 and 30%. Now you can criticize them for that and say, well, maybe socially you should have lower returns and so on. That's not for me to judge. But you can actually also use that to your advantage. The first thing is 15 versus 30% is a big difference. And that difference stems to the level of risk that you give them. If you put developers in a situation where your land and permitting and regulation procedures and so on are so messed up that they don't know whether they will get the permits in 1 year, in 5 years, or never, they will ask for 30%. If you speed that up and find ways that you can actually let them hold on to their equity and only even put their money on the table once the land and the permitting is cleared, their risk massively drops and they can go for much lower returns. Similarly, increasing their returns is not only viable via subsidies, which is the most discussed flavor, usually tax incentives of some form with all the issues around corruption and so on that it entails. But you can also as easily or importantly increase IRRs by compressing time schedules, which again comes down to lower permitting times and the like, but it also comes down to applying different approaches to development and construction. If you move to industrialized construction approaches in those places where it works, this may not work in the poorest area of Africa, for instance, but if you move to industrialized construction approaches with prefabrication, with large-scale construction sites, we would be talking at a minimum 5,000 units a year. Then you can actually take roughly half of the time schedule out of construction. And this way double the IRR for developers, or the other way around, significantly lower the cost at which they are able to provide the units, and actually also make it very attractive for them to offer those units, or actually to enter that market. Thank you.